Good morning and welcome to today's session of the UK Trade and Business Commission. And this morning we're looking at skills and inward investment into the UK, two really important components of our future economic success. We've got two panels today, the first looking at skills, the second at investment. And I'm very grateful to all of our witnesses for having given up their time to give us the benefit of their expertise and knowledge and insight. And I'm going to invite the first panel just to briefly introduce themselves before we turn to the first question. So if I could start with, first of all, Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky Newton. I'm Director of Public Policy and Research at the Institute for Employment Studies.
Welcome. Alex?
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Horchen. I'm Principal Policy Advisor for Sustainability, Employment and Skills at the Institute of Directors.
And Terence.
Hello, I'm Terence Hogarth. I'm a professor at the Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick, where I run a programme of research on the links between the labour market and vocational training.
Well, it's good to meet you all in pixelated fashion. Right, I'm going to turn to Tamara for the first question.
Thank you, Chair. What effects are skills and labour shortages having on the UK's economy and on the UK's ability to attract international trade and investment? Are these issues equally common in other countries, or is the UK more affected? I'd like to start with Terence, please.
I think the first issue to address is, what's the scale of skill shortages and labour shortages? I mean, we've clearly gone through a very disruptive period, and one would expect to see some sort of disruption to labour supply over that period. But I think what we're really interested in are skill shortages, and skill shortages are very difficult to define. I think the Employer Skills Survey suggests that around about 1% of employment overall is affected by skill shortages. And clearly, where companies do have skill shortages, there is evidence that it does affect what they do, and a small proportion. And again, in the Employer Skills Survey, do report that it results in things like loss of orders. I think whether or not it affects the capacity for firms to invest here, I think the evidence base there is rather weak. I think that's probably more to do with, in the first instance, the product market strategies that companies set for themselves, and how they're going to put together sort of human resource practices and so on and so forth to meet their skill needs, rather than necessarily just being a reflection of what's available in the labour market.
I mean, thank you, Terence. That's interesting, because in my sector, I'd say that's the opposite. In the fashion industry, we don't have trained garment workers at pace. And before Brexit, we were getting orders because of the largely Eastern European garment workers. Now we're losing those orders because we haven't met the capacity that we could have. So that's interesting that it differs. Becky, what are your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, I mean, I would, obviously second the points that Terence was making about the kind of scale and effect. I mean, there are sectoral variations, of course. I mean, some estimates sort of suggest the country could lose up to 120 billion of income due to skills shortages by 2030 across the economy. With shortages of 2.5 million highly skilled workers and an oversupply of lower skilled people. So it is a huge scale of problem. I think it does affect differently across different industries. I think generally, and other analysis shows the recovery of the UK coming out of the pandemic is much slower than we're seeing in other countries. I think, the skills issue has long precedents right back over time, where we've wanted to increase the skills in our economy, but actually we struggle to do so. And we struggle to see the investment in the existing workforce. I think, we face a sort of huge demographic change with an aging workforce, the need, huge disruptors in the economy from the, greening issues, climate change, demography, but also kind of automation and AI. And these are sort of challenges that we really need to face up to. We've been predicting the need for increasing skills levels, but not really being able to adapt to that change sort of quickly enough. So I think we need to think about that. I'm not an expert on sort of inward investment policy, so it's interesting to hear your insight into how that is affecting the industry tomorrow. But it feels to me that we need to put a lot more focus on skilling in our existing workforce as well as on the talent pipeline, and ensuring that where we encourage migration, that we encourage those workers to be also continuing their skills development whilst they're with us in employment.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I mean, I think this is going to be a fascinating session that the Commission is hosting today, because the adjuncts between skills and labour and investment are well known. I mean, I personally, not with the Commission, but personally put forward a lot of cases that the T levels for the skills for garment workers, for instance, had to be shored up against us leaving the EU, because we were going to lose those workers. And they chose not to do that. They're not rolled out until September of this year. And that's meant a loss of earnings, because we've had several years where we haven't been able to meet commitments, and so commitments have gone down. I'd like to go to Alex to answer the existing question, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, in terms of the IOD membership perspective, labour and skills shortages are having a significant negative impact on our members. We actually regularly poll our members on the negative factors that are affecting their organisation. And last month, this involved a poll of 859 business leaders, and 49% of those selected skills shortages as having a negative impact on their organisation. Now, to give that some context, that was second only to UK economic conditions at 51%, and was actually ahead of the cost of energy, which of course has received a huge amount of media attention. So we know it's having a really significant impact on our members, as well as sort of making the UK a less attractive place to invest. From what we hear from members more anecdotally, it's stifling growth in sort of potentially high growth sectors. I spoke to a business leader who's running a renewable energy company who has, for obviously obvious reasons, seen soaring demand that he simply can't meet because he can't access the skills in his area, and is struggling sort of through the apprenticeship system. But obviously that takes time. So to address the question as well about, are these issues equally common in other countries? I think, as Becky mentioned, there's evidence that we're having a particularly slow recovery from the pandemic compared with competitor nations. We suspect that part of that, obviously we've got an early storm of things like early retirement, perfect storm of things like early retirement, aging population, long-term sickness, but also changed migration patterns post-Brexit, which are obviously having an impact. So I suspect that might be part of the reason why it's particularly acute in the UK.
Sorry, my phone just started ringing right on time. I'm so sorry, I was unmuted. I do apologise to the Commission. I mean, one point before I defer back to the Chair, I just want to raise is that all of these issues have an impact. The last Nottingham lace factory, Cluny Lace, that has been thriving for 9 generations of business, is now facing closure. It had 20 members of workforce before we had left the EU. But because we've lost the dyeing, we've lost the skills for dyeing, they send to France for most of the colour dyes and then send back, and they're being hit with double whammies on those costs, and they are looking at closure. And for me, this is a national tragedy to lose those skills. Once lost, we've lost them forever. So I just wanted to raise that point before deferring back to the Chair, but thank you very much for your answers.
Tamara, thank you very much indeed. And that last example has had some publicity. I think it's the way it's treated by HMRC and the VAT. So it's really striking. Right, I'm now going to turn to Mike Cohen. Mike, over to you.
Thank you. I'm interested in the role of government in tackling these problems with skills and labour shortages. Is government doing enough at the moment, and what sort of initiatives should it be pursuing? Could we start with Becky this time, please?
Yeah, I mean, successive governments have been sort of aiming to address this agenda. But I think what we often see is redevelopment of the skills system, of qualifications, but not actually sort of that takes time to do. So we've seen some useful developments from the revised apprenticeship standards to the development of the T-level standards, but actually, and to Tamara's point there about the rollout, that has quite a slow effect, sort of in terms of how it comes into the economy and starts impacting on the skills available in the workforce. So it feels to me that there's been a lot on that kind of design side, but that is quite a time-consuming thing to tackle. And so you see quite slow effects into the labour market. I think we've seen some interesting sort of skills models. So the built camps do give us a shorter, prompter kind of more rapid skilling opportunity, but we're not clear yet how that articulates with some of the developments around the kind of training and occupational standards that we see for apprenticeships and for the T levels. I think the higher technicals, we're sort of looking to those again, really useful qualifications. We know business use these qualifications. They're often qualifications that employers themselves were involved in developing. They're not new, but people don't know enough about them. And I think our risks, as I've sort of indicated in my last point, we're really around once people enter the workplace, there's not enough skilling activity, there's not enough learning and training going on. People are allowed to stagnate, which is problematic. So there are, we see quite big employment gaps, but we also see gaps in who gets access to training and the types of training they are able to take part in. So the more highly skilled you are, the higher your occupational level, the more likely it is you are to get training. If you're you've entered into a sort of entry level, sort of relatively low skilled work area, you are quite unlikely to see training to help you progress, and the number of training days and employer investment in training has dropped over successive years if you do look at the employer skills survey. So I think we need to be doing more to tackle this. I know some people will argue about the effects of the apprenticeship levy. I think we probably need to think beyond the levy policy and to think how else can we get training and skills development happening more consistently once people are in the workforce, as well as developing those options for the talent pipeline, which I think that kind of talent pipeline work is going okay. We probably need to sort of get that pace working so it does meet industry needs. I hope that goes a good starting point.
Yeah, thank you, Becky. That's really interesting. Alex, could I get your views next, please?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd echo a lot of what Becky said. I think to start with the positives, I think we have seen, as Becky said, some genuinely quite exciting skills reforms in the past few years, which have genuinely sought to build in employer input from the start and have a potential to at least make a dent in skills shortages. T-levels and skills boot camps, I think, are probably the best examples of that, where they've been designed in partnership with employers and target areas of skill shortage. Level 3 guarantee, I think, is another example of a policy which does recognise at least the importance of upskilling people who are already in the workforce, although we think there are really changes that could be made to make that more effective. I think our position is that ultimately we're missing a piece in the policy armory when it comes to skill shortages. So we've recommended that the government creates a fully independent or technocratic shortage occupations agency that has a statutory remit to systematically advise on current and future skills shortage areas for the UK economy. And the insights of that organisation would then be able to feed into various other areas of government policy, whether that's immigration or tax incentives for employers to invest in training in shortage skills areas. And we kind of feel that until we have something like that, which will resemble in part the Future Skills Unit, which was recently set up in the DfE, but again, we think it needs to be beefed up essentially and have more independence. I think until we see something like that, the sort of centralized production of insights on which policy can be based, we're going to continue to have a fairly piecemeal approach to skill shortages, and it won't systemically deal with the issues that we're seeing.
Thank you. That's great. And I'm slightly conscious of time and our agenda moving on, but Terence, can I just ask if you've got anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to say there is clearly something curious going on. If you look over the past 40 years, we've created an education and training system that's meant to be responsive to employers' needs. So we created a strong external market for training that employers are meant to use. They have a high degree of influence over that. We've had massive expansion in higher education in the past 40 years. And I suppose the argument is, the question is that failing in some way? And I think it's quite difficult to pinpoint actually what's actually going wrong, but it may have something to do with the fact that companies have externalized the problem of solving their skill needs. It needs to be a program of some sort that needs to deliver that. And you have to ask yourself the question, then why aren't employers actually making those investments themselves? And I think it has something to do with the fact that we've, again, over the past 40 years, we've created a flexible labour market where we want people to move between jobs, between sectors. But a consequence of that, of course, is that the single employer can't necessarily appropriate the return on the investment they make in an employee. And I think, it's how do you sort that issue out, I think is the critical issue. And clearly, we're struggling there a little bit.
Thanks, Terence. Thanks to everybody. Some really interesting points, I think, for me, there on ongoing training and upskilling of existing workforces. So thank you. I'll pass back to the chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. I'm now going to turn to Jeff Mackey. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just moving on from Mike's question, and I'd like to continue to start the conversation about how the government would approach things. I'm interested in the effects of long-term illness and economic inactivity on the conversation around labour shortages and the economy. I know, Becky, you mentioned the pandemic already, but what effects are these having on what we're doing? Could we start with you, please?
Yes, our analysis, we are quite vocal on the need to support people to re-engage with the labour market, that we do have a participation crisis at the moment, but it will need us to do things differently to support people to re-enter. There is a pool of talent and skills that could be drawn in, but it will take different forms of employment support to enable that to really happen, as well as support to employers to do things differently. We know most employers are not very good at offering, for example, flexible working, that they have ongoing concerns about part-time and flexible work models, and part-time and flexible work models tend to be lower paid, which isn't hugely supportive of re-entry. But we also, I think we see this discomfort about job design and doing things differently. And I think we need to see more collective support to employers to build their capability to redesign work to be more supportive of people with health conditions and impairments to move back into the labour market and to be productive there. So it feels to me we kind of need to tackle two sides. Our latest findings from a large trial sort of focused on people with health conditions, long-term health conditions, and who had spent lengthy time out of employment, showed that individualised, tailored support, sort of thinking about goals and capability, and sort of providing that support into employment and to employers can make a difference to people's progression back into the workplace. But I think we do need to build that confidence and capability amongst the employers and sort of work that kind of model at a larger scale. So I think there does need to be partnership to make this happen. And we do have a pool of talent that we can access if we do make it happen.
Thank you very much. Terence, long-term illness and economic inactivity.
I'll defer to what Becky said, given her institute's done a lot of the interesting research in the area. I would say, I mean, first of all, we need to look at what happens over time. We're obviously going through still a disruptive period following COVID. So we need to see what happens with participation rates over the slightly longer term. But I do think there's a huge wealth of evidence out there which demonstrates how you engage people, how you re-engage people in the labour market. And we've collated that evidence over the past 30 or 40 years. And it may be just a case of returning to that, looking at what works well and getting employers to work with that. But, you know, I don't think there's any shortage of evidence to suggest how you can re-engage people in the labour market.
Thank you. Good morning, Alex. And what are your members telling you?
Yeah, I mean, from the business perspective, I think the two elements which could be of most use here are, as has been discussed, flexible working, occupational health as well. And I think in both those cases, as Becky said, the focus here should really be on how government can work in partnership with business to improve businesses' ability to offer those two things. So, you know, the government's currently legislating to make the right to request flexible working a day one employment right, which we absolutely support. We have evidence from within IOD membership that there's increased awareness and intent to offer at least some forms of flexible working. I would completely agree with points that have been made elsewhere that obviously flexible working is so much more than remote working. And if we really want to utilise that to tackle economic inactivity as a result of long-term sickness, then we need to be looking at improving the offer of part-time working, shared jobs, things like that. So that kind of partnership model between government and business, I think, is really important. On occupational health, we're starting to see some government pilots of subsidising occupational health provision for SMEs, which we think is really promising. We'd like to see government sort of expand that pilot if it proves to be successful.
Thanks very much. Alex, could I roll on to my next question, please? Because you'd actually talked about the need for an agency and the question of where that agency sat when we talk about skills and shortages within this education and training space. And I think your phrase was, we need to beef it up. What does that look like as we move forward? How does the government actually deal with this from a policy perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So the beef it up comment was in reference to the Future Skills Agency, which was recently set up as an arm of the Department for Education, which we think is a good start in terms of having a body that is producing evidence on future skills needs. We'd like to see that as independent of any particular government department, to be sort of much more technocratic in the way that it operates, so that it would routinely produce analysis of current and future sort of projected skills needs. But the key for us is that the government would then, use the insights from that to develop policies in various areas. I mentioned immigration earlier, skills. For example, we think that government could then use the tax system to incentivize businesses to invest in training for areas identified by the skill shortage agency. We also think that sole traders should be allowed to deduct for tax purposes the costs of reskilling in areas that are entirely new for their business, which they're not currently able to do if those areas are identified as priorities by that shortage occupations agency. So really, we want it to be beefed up in the sense that it'll be independent and have a sort of statutory remit to do that work. And then government can sort of systematically use that insight to inform its policies across the board, across departments, in terms of how it deals with skill shortages.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much. Terence, when we were talking about, or your remarks earlier on when we got into education and training, you actually mentioned the question of flexibility, and I've heard the word flexibility mentioned several times already. When regarding education and training and employer needs, how do we bring those together to allow policies to be developed?
It's a tricky question. I think we've developed an innovative system in the UK for getting the education and training system to respond to employers' skill needs. And really, it's a question. You know, we have a lot of training providers who are primed to respond to the requirements of employers, and we've developed that over a very long period of time. And it's really about getting that to work better in some way, and getting employers to recognize what their skill needs are, and getting them to invest in the skills that they think they require. But I do think the problem, we keep on saying there's a problem with skills supply. I think there's a bigger problem with skills demand. And we're constantly looking to say, how can we improve the supply side? And we've had initiative after initiative after initiative to try and deal with that. But in many respects, I think we need to understand why the current system might not deliver what employers want. But I think we need to focus a lot more actually on building that demand for skills in the first place, and getting employers to raise their product market strategies so that we create a demand for much more high-skilled work, high-value work. And I think that's the bigger problem than the skills supply one. I don't think that answers your question, but I just think building that demand, I think, is perhaps more important.
No, I think it's a really good point. I mean, so what you're talking about is workforce planning for prediction in the medium and long term.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of employers, smaller employers, it's sort of day-to-day firefighting, and they don't necessarily have that long-term view about what skill needs they'll require in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years' time, and how they actually might acquire those skills, and how do they put the planning in place to do that. And maybe that's one of the areas where we need to invest further in the future. Many years ago, we had Train to Gain. Train to Gain didn't work terribly well, but actually there was a germ of a nice idea in there, and perhaps it was probably more its execution than the idea itself about how you support companies to actually engage in workforce planning, and then identify how those skill needs can be met from a range of training providers. And maybe we need to go back to looking at those types of things. I'm not advocating Train to Gain because there were some problems with it, but nonetheless, there was a germ of a really interesting idea in there.
Really, really interesting. Thank you. And Becky, we're talking about policies for skills shortages, but we're now talking about demand side as well. Would you like to comment on this to finish this question off, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something about trying to, and I really take on board Terence's points there. I think some brokerage model, some support to employers to start predicting their skills need and to think about how they meet them. We definitely need to be developing the skills rather than thinking we can just bring them in, from a talent pipeline, whether that's migration, whether that's the education system. We actually need that continuing building of the skills base and to sort of think ahead. I think often employers don't realise the effect of carrying on in the way they are. So there's been some work around PISA and the PIAC surveys, which showed actually you spend more manager time putting in the workarounds to support people who can't be very productive in their role. And actually then if you did do the training, you could release that manager time, do something more with that time. And I think it's trying to get that sense of cost and benefit, the incentive right for employers to take action. I also think it's quite a complicated world for employers to access some of this stuff. And I think we need to simplify things. So there can be an awful lot of demands on employers and it's not terribly well coordinated. And I think that can be off-putting. We've got lots of initiatives, so the local skills improvement plans, we've got local enterprise partnerships, we've got initiatives which look for employers to engage with schools, we've got the work around colleges and independent training providers and so forth, engaging around apprenticeships and T-levels. There's a lot of demands. It's not very well coordinated. And so I wonder whether there is something, and particularly with the kind of models around devolve responsibility for, say, adult education training. We've got lifelong learning entitlement coming at the individual level. Should we do a bit more local level coordination that enables employers to feel they can engage with something and think about their skills needs and how they meet them? For them, and from some of our research, the notion of there being a skills system is really, it doesn't exist from their point of view. There are lots of initiatives that aren't very well connected. So I feel like we need to put that connectivity in place, deliver some brokerage. I possibly think that maybe that was where Terence was alluding. I wouldn't like to presume, but I do think there was something in Train to Gain that was trying to go into employers and help them think about their skills. And, this could help us achieve better progression in work, which will also help individuals as well as the wider economy.
That's great. Thank you very much. The conversation around local implementation of national policies, I feel, will continue. Chair, back to you, please.
Jeff, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Charles Rose. Charles.
Good morning. Thank you. My questions link immigration and skills shortages. And the first is, with regard to immigration reform, what sort of policies should be put in place in both the short and the long term? How should we think about the balance between developing and importing skills, and how can immigration policy reform be used to complement a broader skills strategy? Nothing complicated in that. Can we start off with Alex, please?
Yeah, thank you. I think I just want to start by saying I think there's a fairly widespread misconception that business pushes for immigration as the easy route out of skills shortages, sort of over-investing in the local workforce. Businesses generally are extremely passionate about developing their local workforce, but the fact of the matter is that for a variety of reasons, the current skills system often doesn't adapt quickly enough to changing skills needs. So I think ultimately we need a skills system that responds more quickly and flexibly to changing skills needs, alongside an immigration system that helps employers to plug the gaps while the skills system catches up. So the Shortage Skills Agency that we mentioned earlier, we'd like that to include the current remit of the Migration Advisory Committee to really sort of link up the work that's being done on skills shortages across, local skills policies and immigration. But at the very least, in the short term, we'd like to see the Migration Advisory Committee being commissioned on a more set sort of periodic basis, rather than, say, at the whim of government, because we will see that the MAC not being commissioned for quite some time, which really limits the ability of the immigration system to respond quickly. I think there's another point as well that I just want to quickly make around the accessibility of the immigration system to SMEs, who are far less likely to have the HR resources and often the money to engage with and navigate the complex and expensive immigration system. So if we want to level that playing field more in terms of SMEs' ability to access the skills they need, compared with larger companies, we think work needs to be done to make it more accessible to them.
Thank you. Can I move this on to you, Terence, please?
I mean, there are two issues I think we're trying to address through migration policy. First of all, some jobs exist within an international labour market. We're in competition with other countries in the world to attract that very high skilled talent, and that will always be the case. And then, as Alex was saying, there are times where you have you have skill shortages, skill gaps that need to be plugged, and migration can sometimes be a way of filling that gap. I think the problem is we do have real problems in identifying what is a skill shortage. It's tricky. I mean, often a lot of what gets reported as a skill shortage, it can simply reflect the fact that an employer isn't really paying the going terms and conditions to get someone into that job, or the location may be such that there's limited supply. So we do have real problems in identifying what is a genuine skill shortage. But I think the Migration Advisory Committee actually does a pretty good job of taking a variety of indicators to actually identify what is as best as you can possibly gauge a genuine skill shortage. So I think probably things are in place to deal with that and seem to have dealt with it reasonably well. Clearly, there are some transaction costs to do with visas and so on and so forth, which is outside my area of knowledge. But in terms of identifying what we need, what we can meet from migration, we've got a pretty good system for doing that, I think.
No immigration policy reform that you can identify that you would like that you would promote?
None that immediately come to mind. I mean, there is the point that we don't necessarily want to use migration policy, which would have the impact of not pushing employers to look for alternative solutions to increase their productivity, rather than just relying on labour, relatively cheap labour. But I think to a large extent we've, the Migration Advisory Committee sort of deals with that.
Okay, thanks. Becky, what do you have to say on this?
Well, I defer to Alex and Terence's expertise on these issues. My sense is that migration needs to form part of the solution, and so we do need that well focused. And it plays a very important role in enabling some industries to be able to be productive, and particularly, you think about agriculture, where sort of having sort of migration really supports that industry to function. I think the MAC committee does good work. I think my concern would be, we do need sort of people working in the economy, and some of that will come from migration, but we don't want migrant workers to stagnate any more than we want people, sort of resident population, to stagnate in their employment. So, we need, we've got an aging demographic and smaller generations coming through. Migration is a really important feature then in our society. To get that integration and to get that high quality work for people, we need them to have opportunities to develop and to progress in work alongside the resident population. So I kind of feel that it still takes us back to trying to encourage more sort of skilling activity in employment, however it is that people, whatever their origin, we need to keep that skill level progressing.
Thank you. My next question moves on, and it talks about changes in the labour market, and could changes in the way the labour market operates help reduce skills shortages? For example, could greater provisions for flexible working or for carers leave help fill gaps? And what could the UK government do to help make the UK's labour force the labour market rather, more attractive? Alex, back to you.
Thanks. I think the short answer is yes. There was some interesting research from the ONS with individuals who'd decided to retire early after the pandemic that found that flexible working was the top factor that was likely to entice them back into the workforce. So it's clearly a really key part of any strategy to try and get groups like that back into the workforce in larger numbers. We can also look at the effect that it would have on carers, parents, disabled people. So there's a really quite a large pool of people that initiatives like flexible working and carers leave can try to bring back. I mentioned earlier that we have strong indications from our own members that there's an increasing willingness to engage with various forms of flexible working. On remote working specifically, we have some data from early 2022 that 8 out of 10 business leaders plan to offer employees some degree of remote working in the long term, with actually 27% saying that they were going to offer staff complete choice in that. So I think actually it's a really good time to be having these kinds of conversations with business leaders, partly because of the learnings that we have from the pandemic and partly because of skill shortages. And certainly in the work that we're doing with our members, we're really encouraging them to think of other forms of flexible working as a means to plug those skills gaps. In terms of what government's doing, as we mentioned earlier, they're already legislating to make right to request flexible working a day one employment right, also legislating for, I believe, for carers leave. So I think it's a case of seeing what impact those policies have first before deciding whether we need additional policies. But in the meantime, obviously continue working in partnership with business to promote best practice in these areas.
Thank you. Terence.
We have a flexible labour market, and we've been having these conversations for a very, very long time. But there's been lots of legislation over the recent decades, which have made the UK labour market a relatively flexible one. I think it's probably a case of identifying where that flexibility isn't used and whether it can be used. I mean, there may be operational reasons why, in some cases, the types of flexibility that are available to large swathes of the workforce don't work. But there may be cases where, for one reason or another, employers don't want to engage with it. So really, it's a case of there's an advocacy role to persuade employers of the merits of using these flexible practices. But there's also a research role in identifying why it is the case that employers who could avail themselves of these various working practices choose not to do so.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. As somebody who's run small companies, I've tended to shy away from this level of flexibility, just because of the need for certainty and wanting people to be there for the whole shift and not have to change things in and out during the course of the day. But anyway, let's move that back on to you, Becky.
Yeah, so I mean, our latest analysis shows that if we could close some of the employment gaps for disadvantaged groups, particularly older people and disabled people, we'd see 1 million more people in work. So that shows the potential power of providing more flexible options. We do agree that employers need support to be able to use flexibility in ways that works for them. We see a role for the combined authorities, local authorities and the enterprise partnerships to help on that, making sure they're delivering the inclusive growth strategies. And we kind of need employment support organisations and people to advocate. So those people who have contact with employers to advocate for flexible working practices, as well as sort of signpost towards guidance and resources about how practices can be adapted to be more permissive and supportive of people with differing needs. I think your point about a flexible working model, there may be others out there, Charles, that would work for SMEs, but they kind of need the confidence and support and the case examples. So we'd like to see some movement there, and from kind of trade and industry bodies. So at a good government level, we kind of do believe that flexible working should be a default available from day one of entering work, and some public funding to support companies to commit to flexible working from the very outset would be helpful. Things like affordable childcare are going to be really important, thinking about adult care opportunities as well, sort of what can support people to enable them to enter work, as well as what can support employers and how these models can work together. So again, I think I'm going back to quite a partnership approach. There needs to be dialogue, there needs to be support, there needs to be incentives, but it is a really important aspect of what we can do to address some of the shortages we see.
Yeah, but do some jobs lend themselves to this flexibility in a way that others don't? I'm thinking that if you have a situation where a person comes in and works at the desk and that there's a throughput of task that they can slot in, do that for a number of hours, and then go with a relatively smooth handover, that's an easier situation than something where somebody has to, begin an operation at a hospital or something like that, where you have to see it right through to the end. And I think the points that you make about the background support, the caring, and the flexibility provided to people to leave their homes are important. Ona, could you just have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are different forms of flexibility, and we need far more kind of case examples to show how flexible working can operate. So we've looked, if we have done some research sort of in NHS organisations, sort of looking at how there are case examples out there, and sort of what makes it happen is around sort of making sure it's designed and implemented in such a way that enables that flexibility. We won't get over examples that you gave there, Sir Charles, but there may be ways of sort of offering a more part-time model to some people where, you know, despite those kind of needing to be on the job, the flexibility may show in a different way from that. I think on childcare and adult care, we need good policy to support people. While, you know, the policy around sort of more free childcare clearly is an important step forward, there are consequences that we are yet to fully understand and deal with, that, you know, including kind of shortages in the childcare workforce. We need to be thinking about the quality of work that is available kind of in those kind of support workforces to enable other people to, you know, carers to be active in the labour market. I haven't got a solution, but I do agree it's a challenge that we need to tackle.
Thanks very much indeed. And with that, I'm going to hand this back to you, Hilary.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. Just before I come to Mike for the final questions, because we've got just a couple of minutes, we hear a lot about the UK's poor productivity performance. Does anyone want to just briefly comment on the extent to which the question of skills we've been discussing this morning is part of the cause of that? Terence?
I'll give it a go. It's a tricky issue. Yeah. I mean, we tend to think skills are the solution to everything. In many respects, because it's part of the system that you can easily tamper with. You can make changes and so on. But if you want to try productivity, ultimately, it's down to the product market strategies that companies choose to pursue. And if our productivity is low, then, you know, the mix of companies that we have, the mix of product market strategies is probably not where we want it to be. Now, if you don't have the skills, you're not going to be able to realize that product market strategy. I mean, that's, you know, that much is clear. But I think in the first case, there has to be that ambition, those product market strategies, those practices in place that are going to drive up the demand for skills within the workplace. But that's a second. But skills are a second order issue, I think, in this debate.
Well, that's really helpful. Becky or Alex, would either of you like to comment on that?
I mean, just to, in many ways, agree with what Terence has said in the sense that it's clearly not the entire answer. I do think it's hard to argue that it plays no part in it, and I think especially as we see increasingly rapid economic change, for example, the green transition's been mentioned, the impact that AI is going to have, and that rapidity of change is only going to increase over time. Like it's really clear that the current skill system that we have is unlikely to facilitate a productive response to those economic changes. So I'd say sort of yes and no. It's obviously not the whole picture, but it's a really important part of it, and probably one of the reasons why we have lower productivity than comparator countries.
Okay, thanks. Becky, was there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, I do see them as interacting and sort of interrelated and inextricably so. I think there's something, we can't predict the entire future. If we sort of build the resilience through encouraging people to be learning in their work, it helps you to have that learning capability to cope with change, which I think is important. And maybe that does help to build the confidence of employers to aim higher. I suspect, again, we probably need advocacy and work with employers to help them develop that high goal, to then feed back down into how they sort of do support skilling amongst their workforce.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Right, I'm going to turn to Mike for the final question for this first session. Over to you.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting session for me to listen to, as somebody who's worked in education and in a training environment as well in the past, and is currently in an industry with a skill shortage. So really grateful for the thoughts of all of the panel. Thank you. And as always, we're going to end with a very broad question. If you were advising government on this, as how they should be tackling skills issues and labour shortages, what 3 policy recommendations would you come up with? And I'm just going to go across my screen left to right and start with Becky, if I can, please.
So closing employment gaps. So let's work around how we get more people able to be active in the labour market. 2, supporting that skilling to take place. So most of the workers we need in the future are already in work now. So I'm all about that local brand, making the connection so that employers can engage. So using the devolution model, putting the skills support, the advocacy, the brokerage on job design, where employers can access it and access their local workforces. I'm a bit stuck for a number 3 at the moment, so can I come back to you?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Thank you, Becky. Alex, you're next on my screen. Can I turn to you, please?
Yeah, thank you. So the first would be, as sort of mentioned before, to create that independent shortage occupations agency, the remit to systematically advise on current and future shortage areas for the UK economy. I'm conscious that the Labour Party has announced a commitment to establish a Skills England body. So I think we'd encourage government to match that ambition. Number 2 would be around the immigration system, so around making that more responsive to employer need and less expensive and bureaucratic for businesses to source skills that are in genuine short-term shortage. And I think the third one, and I want to pick up on a point that Becky made in response to the last question, is around childcare. So obviously we're pleased to see the developments on childcare policy at the most recent budget. I think there's a lot more to do in this area, so we'd like to see government appoint a childcare czar to drive the agenda forward across government departments, and to undertake a broad-ranging review of the cost and availability of childcare in the UK, which would also encompass questions around the childcare labour force.
Thanks, Alex. Really interesting. I like the ideas you have there around kind of development of bodies or people with that kind of cross-cutting remit across areas of government responsibility, which I think is quite a crucial point. Can I turn to Terence then for the last bit in this session? Thank you.
Yeah, I think we need to have a much better understanding of the scale of skill shortages in this country, and those skill shortages which are persistent. I mean, where are they? What sectors, which parts of the country, what types of employer? We need a much better understanding of what is a skill shortage and why it proves to be persistent. I think we can also look to the past in looking at the types of, I mean, again, over the past 40 years, there's been a huge amount of experimentation in how we can better get skill supply to meet demand. And we need to look back at some of those experiments, see what we can take from them so that we can genuinely learn from the past. Because I think that sort of information, that sort of knowledge is too easily lost. And I also think the third element is that if we want to drive up skills demand, we need to have a better understanding of why a lot of employers are so risk averse when it comes to making investments in their workforce. It's not necessarily that they don't see the need to do so, but there is, I think, a degree of risk aversion to do with whether or not you're actually going to get the return from that investment over the long run, and we need a better understanding of that. So they're the 3 broad areas I think we could look further into in the future.
Thank you, Terence, and recommendations for business there as well as for government, which is very, very helpful. Becky, did you want to chip in a third point while we still have a few minutes?
I think the sort of flexibilities point would just add to it to make sure we find models that can work in different industries to enable that employment gap to close, and to enable people who find it difficult to participate to come into the labour market.
Thank you all very much. A lot of food for thought there for me. So thank you. I'll pass back to the chair.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. Alex, can I just ask you a brief follow-up question on your suggestion of the skills shortage body that you say should be created? Would you envisage that part of what it would do is to make recommendations to the government about particular jobs that would be added to the shortage occupation list? Because at the moment we have, I mean, if we think of the example that we've dealt with as the commission when we visited a fruit farm in Kent, the farmer there who'd had to plant less crop because he couldn't find the workers to pick it the previous year, along with other farmers, was making representations to DEFRA, and eventually the government issued more visas. But how do you envisage the interaction would work on the question of shortage occupation jobs?
Yeah, so we think that the agency should encompass the remit of the Migration Advisory Committee to really integrate the work that's being done across government and the great work being done by the Migration Advisory Committee to really integrate that work across government. So we'd see it encompassed in its remit. Okay,
that is really helpful. Well, on behalf of the Commission, can I thank you, Becky, Alex and Terence for a really terrific session. You've given us a lot to think about, and we are once again extremely grateful to you for giving up your time this morning to talk to us. And we're now going to move on, I hope, to our second session. Can I just ask, yes, I think we've got all three of our witnesses. I can see you before me. So let's crack on. Now, just remind everyone, this second session is looking at inward investment into the UK, which is a really, really important issue. And we're looking forward to hearing what our witness is. Thank you very much for contributing to the work of the Commission today. I'm just going to ask each of you briefly just to introduce yourselves before I put the first question, and I'll start with you, Rupert.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Rupert Gaither. I'm the Executive Chairman of Invest UK, which is a private consultancy business helping international entrepreneurs and investors establish or invest in UK SMEs. So we're very much focused on SMEs. We've been going around about 8 years and have a wide experience. And I've actually submitted a paper to Maheen that I hope maybe she can screen share in the course when we come back to evidence.
Thank you very much indeed. Nigel?
Hi, so I'm Nigel Driffield. I'm a Professor of International Business at the University of Warwick. I'm the lead on all things inward investment for the ESRC-funded Productivity Institute. And I've been researching inward investment in the UK and indeed the UK labour market since I did my PhD on the same in 1992. So I've been at it a while.
That means we expect a lot of you when we put our questions. Thank you very much. And lastly, Jenny.
Yes, good morning. I'm Jenny Tooth. I'm Executive Chair. I think it says CEO, but I moved aside to being Executive Chair this year of UK Business Angels Association. And we are the trade body for angel and early stage investment in the UK, obviously focusing very much on entrepreneurs and investors here in the UK, but I work very widely internationally with the investment community. I'm not an expert on FDI, but I hope I can make a useful contribution today.
I'm absolutely certain you will. Right, well, let's get going. My first question is, how has foreign direct investment in the UK fared in recent years? What's the trend? And I'm going to come on secondly to look at particular sectors. And what do you think is likely to happen in the years to come? So I'll start with you, Nigel.
Okay, so essentially our value proposition to the world changed with Brexit. Our value proposition on inward investment was essentially a country with relatively flexible labour markets that could be a bridge between, if you like, the EU and the rest of the world. And with Brexit, that changed. So we've seen a decline. We saw a big decline, sort of 2016, 2017 in inward investment, that in the aggregate terms has kind of picked up a little bit. But we've seen kind of big declines, particularly big declines in the sorts of things that generate jobs. In other words, people wanting to create new activity, what we call greenfield investment in the trade. In other words, not buying existing companies, but starting something from scratch. We've seen a big decline there. In some sectors, kind of between 2015 and 2020, it kind of fell by 90%. That's recovered a little bit. The big changes, I'll come on to sectors in a minute, but the big changes have been, we are still a sizable economy, and we are still, there's £1 trillion worth of activity going on in this country. But what we're seeing is now firms who are wanting to come here because they want to sell stuff here, rather than the wider remit of coming here because they want to sell stuff into the European Union. And I'm conscious that you don't have very long, so I shall stop there.
But that is quite a profound change, Nigel, that you've just described. And you said, it fell precipitately and has recovered a bit.
Yes.
But of the type of investment, I invest in Britain to sell in Britain and to sell to other countries, that has not recovered. Is that your assessment?
That's it. There's a higher proportion of, we write kind of a quarterly briefing paper on this for the Productivity Institute, which you can read the ones that we've produced so far afterwards, if you like. But we highlight the declines, and we highlight also the change in the makeup. So historically, a high proportion of the new investment coming into the UK would have been for firms who are looking to basically sell into Europe. And now what we're seeing is it's firms who are going to be focused on the UK market. That is not in itself a bad thing, but that is a reduced proposition, if you like, for inward investors. Now, there's also a whole load of macroeconomic uncertainty going on at the moment, which is not helping. But some of that is related to our decision over Brexit. Some of that is related to the number of chancellors we have had in the last 3 years, for example, and whatever. But there's a whole load of stuff going on. But a high proportion of it, in either directly or indirectly, can be related back to Brexit. But it's never just one thing.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you, Rupert.
Thank you very much indeed. I think the first question to be asked is what was one seeking to achieve with FDI? Because when you answer that question, then which statistic matters to you? So I take issue with Nigel's assertion that Brexit is the cause of reduced FDI, where actually FDI is, in one measure, for example, new job creation, is actually higher now in 2021 than it was in 2017, which he said was the high watermark. But that is the job factor. If you look at the number of projects, I accept the number of projects is lower. And if you look at the amount of capital, that is variable. So I think one has to ask the question, what is FDI for? What are you seeking? What measure do you consider important? Because all the three measures of capital, job creation, and quantity of projects, and indeed the type of projects, whether it's greenfield or that, are going to vary over time. Personally, I don't share, but we can come on to that later in evidence, the feeling that Brexit has been a factor from our point of view, anyway.
Right. Okay. Now that's quite. You're taking a very different view from Nigel, and I suppose the question is, are you disputing the figures? Because presumably they speak for themselves. But what you're saying is you don't think that it is the principal cause in the way that Nigel just indicated.
But what I'm saying, I'm not as with all statistics, Nigel will be able to provide statistics that prove his point, as can I provide statistics to prove my point.
Sure.
I'm reading directly, because I have it right in front of me, of the Department of International Trade's inward investment results, which is a matter of public record. And in 2017, 75,000 jobs were created. In 2021, 84,000 jobs were created, as an example.
Right.
But
Okay.
I accept the fact that jobs may not be the be all and end all. It may be, for example, you'd rather lower job creation, but in different places. You could argue, is high job creation in London a good thing? That's an entirely different debate. So I'm just suggesting that a decision needs to be made about what is FDI for, because then that will immediately affect the policy of what you're going to do to encourage it.
Yeah, no, so very fair point. Jenny, is there anything you want to add at this stage?
I mean, I'm kind of, I guess I'm looking at this in terms of investment, not in kind of infrastructure, but I'm obviously looking at the role that international investors are playing in backing, our innovative, growth-focused businesses here in the UK. And we know that we've had about 26 billion of equity investment into businesses over the last 10 years, and that for me is a very, very important figure. And it was still going strong until right through 2021, when we had a record year, and between 8 and 10% of that equity, particularly in larger businesses, not so much the angel end, was still 8 to 10% of that equity of the 22 billion that was raised in, say, 2021 was from international investors. Therefore, really not wavering in their contribution to businesses, and indeed recognizing an inviting environment overall. I totally agree with the point that, and obviously my concern as well as a trade body, is that probably at least 70% of that international investment is still very much stuck in the Golden Triangle, London, Oxford, Cambridge, and there are huge issues there in the businesses outside. But I've seen a strong interest. There are other issues around Brexit which are affecting the attractiveness of the environment. But I think the biggest change we saw was really the global economic shocks of 21, 22, when all equity investment was down, and therefore commensurately international investment, because it affected everyone. So international equity investors were pulling back, just as UK investors were pulling back. The bigger switch has been, and has always been an issue, and that is that a very, very large proportion of that is US, but we did have very strong European equity investors continuing to be involved in those businesses. The second part of, obviously what we see are the opportunities that international talent and founders bring to this country. So we're seeing a huge proportion of businesses still being set up by international founders, including Europe, and including, we're still seeing very strong businesses. And, we have obviously continued to see, I think, thanks to the visa system, we are still seeing global talent. Though we had a wobble immediately after Brexit, but we have improved our talent visas, and so we are still seeing that. So I'm talking now about innovation, high growth potential businesses, and the strong contribution that I think is continuing, and the interest that's continuing in that environment.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can I turn to the types of inward investment? I suppose my first question for those watching, as well as for myself, is what do we mean by foreign direct investment? Because, for example, if investors from China buy residential property or shopping centres in Britain, does that count as, presumably on some measures, as foreign direct investment? And to pick up your point, Rupert, if a shopping centre is operating at the moment and a foreign investor then buys it from a British owner, does that count as jobs created on those statistics that you were mentioning? And I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, well, residential property is one thing, commercial is another. But when it comes to FDI in manufacturing, what do the figures show and what has been the impact of the change? Rupert, perhaps I could start with you.
Sure, I think you're touching on the right point. They do try and address this by, and Nigel will be a better expert at this, and the difference between greenfield and supported investment.
Right.
I think so that is a clear distinction. I think there is a very important subset of statistics on job preservation. So to use your shopping centre example,
right,
simply acquisition of a shopping centre doesn't really move the needle. I would agree with you, but obviously acquiring a shopping centre, or more importantly, for example, a car manufacturing plant that is then saved, Tata, think Tata, yeah, or a steel mill. One, I think the man on the bus would consider that is foreign direct investment of value, even though no new car plant's been created. It's so Nigel can perhaps just unpack how statistically that is represented, but I think that feeling is there. I think that on the sectors is that we detect, and I have sent Maheen our statistics that you might want to reference later or read later, a very different priority of foreign direct investors, particularly in the SME space, than domestic investors. And this is really to do with the warping effect, I think, of EIS and SEIS, which Jenny will be an expert.
I will pick up on that.
Yeah. But because foreign investors don't benefit from EIS and SEIS, they have different priorities in sector selection than a domestic investor that is benefiting from EIS. And so if we see, for example, of our nearly 500 transactions that we've done, only 11% tech. Now, every business is tech enabled. Yeah. So I'm saying pure tech, which is very underweight. I'm sure Jenny would confirm for the general investment market. But you see much more investment, for example, into manufacturing or education or healthcare, or things that are sectors that are relevant in the country of origin of the investment. So I'm not saying either is more important than the other. That's a sort of different conversation.
Okay.
I'm saying that there is a difference in the profile.
Well, and now, Jenny, we're nodding vigorously, and it might be helpful to those who are watching us if you explain to them what EIS and SEIS are.
Yes, thank you. It's about 27 or 28 years ago now when the government, and it's been supported by governments, all changes, for 27, they recognised the risk that investors were taking in backing very early stage businesses and brought in tax reliefs. Yeah. It began at a lower level, but currently the Enterprise Investment Scheme offers a 30% tax relief if you have an income here in the UK and are. It also offers capital gains tax relief and inheritance tax relief, and you can keep rolling over your capital gains as long as you keep investing. There are regulations around. One of the interesting things for foreign investors is that the company has to be substantially based in the UK, and although it can have other parts of its activity in other parts of the world, it has to be having an economic activity in the UK. There's a further one that was brought in 2012 called Seed Enterprise Investment Scheme, which gives you 50% tax relief for backing very early stage businesses. So the point being, you have to be someone who is having an income here in the UK and making an economic contribution. So if you're non-dom or living somewhere else, you can't use this. the distortion is, of course, that that there are categories of businesses that you can invest in the SEIS and EIS that have to be high risk, generally, have strong IP creation, etc. So lots of areas like consultancy, property, mining, utilities, none of those are backed either by SEIS, EIS. So that again changes the mix of those who are using EIS, SEIS. I mean, it's tremendously successful. Over 2 billion a year is invested in the UK into about 4,000 businesses.
Okay. Now
so
that is
just
really
that differential of where the appetite is and where they can invest.
That is extremely helpful. Now, Nigel, on this question about different types of investment, how it's measured.
Right. Okay. So I'll be as brief as I can.
Yeah.
So the simplest distinction is the one we've already mentioned, which is creating something new, usually called greenfield investment, as opposed to buying something, acquisition. Now, within that, there are, and this is when one can, as Rupert says, one can prove whatever one wants with statistics. Within that, then particularly then the FDI statistics that one sees, particularly at an aggregate level, are then subject to all sorts of biases. So, for example, in one of the peak years around 2015, 2016, one of the large buildings in London, it wasn't the Shard, but one of those changed hands. In fact, two changed hands, to give you the example. One was a foreign acquisition of what was essentially previously a UK business. So money will have come into the UK. That will show up in the foreign investment statistics. The other one was basically one foreign entity, a sovereign wealth fund, buying a business from another foreign entity. Now, probably that money never came into the UK. I can't say, but it's probable that money was transferred between one parent company and another. So although there was £2 billion worth of assets changed hands, it possibly never showed up in any foreign investment statistics because the money never came to the UK, whereas the first one did. Now, in terms of net contribution to the UK, those two things are probably very similar, although in one case £2 billion is coming in. So you get these anomalies, particularly when you look at short-term things. Now, in terms more generally of the sorts of, back to Rupert's point, then when one focuses on just the greenfield bit for a minute, essentially then typically one gets one of two things. One is either interested in generating jobs, or one is interested in the sorts of knowledge and technology that comes in that might then generate productivity growth and knowledge spillovers and all of those things. Now, typically, it's very rare to find both of those in the same place. You either get sort of, a DHL hub or something like that, or an Amazon warehouse, which is creating lots of jobs, or you get sort of investment in a biotech lab somewhere. And advanced manufacturing is the sweet spot of those two things.
Yeah.
Okay, I could keep going, but that's,
I know. Well, we're going to move on to we're going to explore a number of these things as the questioning progresses, but that is really, really helpful. I'm going to now turn to Alan Winters. Alan.
Thanks very much, Hilary, and thanks to the panel members. Hello, Nigel. We've known each other a long time. So I want to switch attention to the EU, or relations with the EU. And I wonder if you can give us an account of how you think the UK's position so far as attracting investment from the EU has changed since Brexit, implicitly, I guess, and to what extent you think that sort of regulatory stability or regulatory alignment perhaps also are important for that. And I suppose, to be positive, are the things, well, I suppose, do you think the government ought to do something, and if so, what? Jenny, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. I mean, clearly we've always had extremely strong relationships between small businesses and Europe. That's been a huge focus for them. When we look at kind of innovation and kind of research opportunities, clearly, I know you'll hear me say this, that we've had for many years the incredibly strong relationship with the Horizon programme, which in the UK as a contributor, we actually were a net gainer, and we have had fantastic collaborative relationships built through that. And whilst we've had a holding pattern since Brexit, we are possibly now finally getting near to a resolution to this as we solve the Northern Ireland protocol issues, which was the big blocker. Clearly, we've established huge opportunities there, and indeed, the vaccines, during COVID was a prime example of how we leveraged all of those kind of relationships, and the opportunities to continue to do so in Europe is very important. The amount of grants that was coming in to support science and research was extremely strong at that time. Clearly, it's always been a very attractive location to EU investors. There have never been as strong an opportunity as they are for US equity investors. They have the deeper, bigger pockets and have continued, as have Asian investors. But we have had always very, very strong amount, probably around 6% of external equity has come from EU sources, which has had distinct wobbles since Brexit, although it's not disappeared entirely, and you can still see those investors. But if you look at the proportion, it's much, much smaller than the US. And in terms of actual kind of market opportunities and growth, clearly the European markets have been extremely strong, extremely accessible, and all of the supply chain issues and all of the challenges of international trade have therefore impacted incredibly on small businesses. I think in terms of talent, that has been one of the biggest issues, because so much of the talent that small businesses accessed in terms of skills was easily flowing from Europe, and that has definitely had an impact. And if you look at the switch, we've been switching massively to outside Europe to find that talent. Although we can't deny that we've had many, many small businesses with founders from Europe still creating very, very value-driven businesses here in the UK. But we do have a more difficult and much less attractive environment without some of those opportunities that we could have when we were part of the EU. And that, of course, affects wider international investors' perception of our environment for attracting science, innovation, and opportunities.
Okay, thank you very much. Rupert.
I would say disagree on the Brexit point, because that's not my experience, that this is at the root of all evil in this area.
Not the root.
But I think there is a distinction between, should we say, knowledge-based FDI and capital-based FDI. Mm-hmm. And the knowledge-based FDI, by that I mean, for example, third country deals operated from the City of London, whether the capital markets or the legal profession or anything else like that, is largely unaffected, and that the UK has maintained its position, which is largely to do with the density of skills and capital within the UK economy. I think the UK remains a very attractive destination for entrepreneurs, largely to do with, we'll come on to this more, access to capital being a very important factor for international entrepreneurs, European entrepreneurs. I think where we've always pre-Brexit and now been at a disadvantage is on capital FDI. By that I mean building car plants or building factories or battery gigafactories, anything like that, where we've always been a relatively poor relation in European terms. And I don't detect many capital flows of capital infrastructure type investing from Europe into the UK, never did and don't now. If you look at the FDI flows, the biggest recipient of FDI, certainly when I last looked at it, which is about a year ago, is actually Poland in Europe. And Poland is receiving huge quantities of FDI, mainly from Germany. And the reason is because Germany wants to outsource its manufacturing capacity out of the Eurozone into the non-Eurozone. Now, this represents an opportunity because we're also out of the Eurozone. So I think that you could, through deliberate policy, change the needle. But I think we are a poor relation in for the big numbers. And it goes back to Jenny's point and one we made earlier about what is it you're after. If you're after big battery gigafactories, you need to change the policy. If you're after knowledge-based FDI and innovation and third country professional services, then we're on broadly the right track.
Okay, thank you very much. Nigel.
So if we go back to the original question, which was, I think, FDI from Europe, I confess we've done slightly better than I imagined we might on that. I think one of the reasons is, I mean, as I said before, let's not pretend that the UK suddenly sort of its GDP went to naught. There's still a sizable economy with sizable investment propositions. And I think what we're seeing in some cases, there are just like as soon as you put frictions between two markets, some firms will think, well, let's jump the frictions in either direction. And just like we're seeing UK firms investing in the EU where they want to be in that market, we're also seeing European firms invest in the UK because of some of the opportunities, particularly that we offer in terms of infrastructure projects and that sort of thing. So we are still seeing investment in that area, but they are, as Rupert just said, they're typically linked to particular market opportunities, like, for example, HS2 contracts. And I'm not dissing HS2 contracts, but when you're spending however many billions on a set of capital infrastructure projects, you can see why inward investors think, well, we'll go and set up a business in that country to have access to that market, sort of thing. So we are seeing that. The other thing to remember that I thought Rupert was going to touch on but didn't, but you might have touched on this in your previous session, is largely still our labour market and our labour market flexibility is preferable for business to an awful lot of, particularly the, if you like, the old EU. There are, I am fully in favour of what President Macron is trying to do with the labour market in France, but it is still much easier to, if you like, to employ and to reallocate labour resources in the UK than it is, say, in France, Belgium, Holland.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think I'm taking the next question as well, which in a sense is so the rest of the world. I mean, what do you think the general perception of the UK among foreign investors is? I mean, do we appear open for business, or have we sort of blown that? And part of that you might want to touch on whether we actually need to add a more generous subsidy regime so far as industry in general, or to foreign investors. So Rupert, why don't you start with you?
I had the opportunity to have at lunch with the Secretary of State for DIT, and I said that she should go to bed and engraved on her heart, on her pillow, is ease of doing business as the main benchmark on this. Because if you get that right, I think all the other good things will follow. And we are currently 8th and sort of heading south on that. And that captures all the kind of the technical things that you would expect a tax, it's all that stuff is within the ease of doing business. So that would be one certainly that I think government officials should be taking very close attention on. They are largely small countries who are ahead of us, apart from the States. that are more agile. But I mean, without getting into the pros and cons of Brexit, one of the theoretical benefits of Brexit was that we become a smaller, agile country and therefore can do things that Singapore and New Zealand are also capable of doing. When I talk to foreign audiences on FDI, which I do a lot, I have three sort of trite, well, not trite, they're important to me, but they're three easy to understand, should we say, sound bites of reasons to invest in the UK, which I call language, law, and learning. And we are blessed with the global lingua franca, and that really matters to an awful lot of people. And that's there. The education is particularly important to people because it introduces hundreds of thousands of international people to the UK through their education experience, largely enjoyable. And certainly the reputation, for example, of us having 4 of the top 10 global universities is noticed by an awful lot of people in terms of how they perceive that. And then the law, that's the learning bit. And then the law is really the legal infrastructure that means that people, if they invest or do business here, they can be certain of reaping the benefits of what they have. And it's no coincidence, for example, that the Dubai free trade zones operate under English law. Mm-hmm. And so I would say my soundbite: language, law, and learning.
Okay, so you're fairly sanguine. I mean, you said your view is that FDI is not suffering particularly, and those 3 factors still continue. I mean,
those 3 factors are very robust and enduring. I'm sure government would love to claim the credit for them, but I don't think it can claim the credit for any of them. But they are enduring. I think where government can make a difference, a direct policy difference, is in ease of doing business. And I would be concerned on that. I think that, again, nothing to do with Brexit, so I'd be banging on about it, but just for tax, etc. reasons, we are heading south on that list, and that's not a good thing.
Nigel?
I don't disagree with very much of what Rupert's just said. I'd add a 4th one, which the UK has always been good in, which is certainty over policy and certainty over markets. And that's the one that I think we are putting most in danger at the moment. We've got a project going on through the Productivity Institute where the people that we're talking to specifically are chief execs of UK subsidiaries of foreign businesses. So they're already here, but of course, when they want investment in their entity, they basically need to persuade their global board of the UK being a good bet. Now, that's a slightly different market from Rupert's market. You know, they're people who are already here, but the global board is making a choice, to use Rupert's example, between a car plant in Poland and a car plant in Oxfordshire, for example. And they are all saying Britain is a tough gig at the moment, not because of any of those 3 things that Rupert said have changed, but the other things, particularly over certainty over policy and certainty over not so much demanding regulatory alignment, but wanting to know what that alignment is going to be or not be, so that you can make decisions. And seeing, on the one hand, if your currency depreciates, which ours has, on the one hand, you can say, well, then it means that investing in the UK is cheaper. At the same time, you also earn your money in pounds, which if you want to change those back into yen or dollars or whatever, you obviously get fewer for them. Now, in a time of we wrote a paper on this a few years ago, but in a time of certainty, then the cheapness wins, as it were, and investment comes in. In a time of uncertainty, risk wins, you move up the risk return profile, and money doesn't come in quite the same way. And at the moment, where we are is we've moved, if you like, up the risk return trade-off. So companies are wanting higher returns when they are considering reinvesting here.
Okay, thank you very much. Jenny.
Yes, thank you. I obviously do have I have concerns in terms of our environment to support growth and innovation here in the UK. We have been for many years a much lower spender on innovation than many other countries in the world, and we have been down at number 27. We kind of creep around, but if you look at the OECD figures, that shows you we have those issues. We also have, in terms of skills, we have a very considerable skills gaps in new technologies. This is something obviously everyone's trying to address, but as you know, we do not have the skilled labour force in many of the new and emerging technologies that we have here in the UK. And as you know, our educational system is still extremely bad, as our Prime Minister is always saying about STEM, and mathematics and so on. So for anyone looking at the skills and the workforce for growing businesses here, we still have many challenges. We do have a very strong entrepreneurial environment, and that has been, and we've had, as we said, tremendously strong support for entrepreneurship. We have a very low level of spin-outs in this country. We're one of the lowest in spin-outs, and we're trying to address that. And we have wonderful universities who do not exploit all of their talent and all of their opportunities yet in terms of entrepreneurship. We are pulling together a much better environment for long-term capital. As you know, the US is the place where we have lost so many of our great businesses and talent, because companies could not find the investment they needed here, the long-term patient capital we needed here in the UK. With the help of British Business Bank and the British Patient Capital, obviously additional sums were offered this time. And with some of the more sector-specific support that we're going through, things like life sciences, we are improving that situation. But in terms of the general attractiveness yet of having a very connected finance and innovation ecosystem that will attract what we need, high technology, I think we still got some way to go. So I think, and we also have, of course, many big challenges in creating those pools of capital. For example, we, unlike others, have a appalling record of having pension funds invested in equity, and we've been lacking so much the opportunity to invite international pension funds to back. So we need to increase our opportunity and the attractiveness for that kind of capital if we're not going to lose out a lot to the US and Singapore, and I know Japan SoftBank and all of the others that have very, very strong and deep pools of capital. So I think those are quite important issues for us to consider when we look at the attractiveness of what we want to have is a high growth, knowledge intensive economy.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me hand back straight to Hilary.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Mike Cohen. Mike.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel to look at this in a slightly different, or from a slightly different angle. Can you talk to us about how foreign direct investment is shared across the UK regions, as well as sectorally? Can we harness FDI as a way of levelling up the region? Should we be doing so? And if so, what can government do to encourage that? Could I start with Nigel, please?
Okay, I'm conscious I could do 3 hours on this, so I shall try not to. Right, so the first thing is you literally, if you try and draw a graph showing the distribution of FDI across the standard kind of regions, Northwest, Northeast, West Midlands, you almost can't do it because it looks like everyone else is zero because you need to get London on the same scale. And that hasn't changed since I was a lad, and doesn't look like changing. We've plotted some graphs for this quite recently. You do, particularly if you look at short term, you get a big jump. Like there was a couple of billion invested offshore wind in Tyneside, in the northeast somewhere. So suddenly it looks like, the northeast generate, getting huge amounts of it. So, but if you take out sort of short term things like that, it's really concentrated. It's almost, I sent a graph of this to the Commission Secretariat yesterday, so you can look for yourselves. But one of the things that struck me when I looked at this recently was, historically, over the last kind of maybe 20 years, it's been London and the Southeast. And our last graph basically says it's London. So it's getting more concentrated. I think, to be fair to people who are working very hard in the regions to try and attract inward investment, the West Midlands and Manchester just about punch their weight. If you compare them with similar kind of cities in the sectors that they're looking to generate, the sort of West Midlands and Greater Manchester just about punch their weight. The rest of the UK does not do very well. Do you want me to go on to how you could use foreign investment for levelling up? I'm conscious, you've only got 20 minutes left. Do you want to let the others speak?
If you could give us just a flavour, and
right.
we'll try and get around everybody, but I feel like we've only heard half the story there.
Okay, so as I said before, there are two reasons why you attract inward investment into a location. Either you want the technology that comes with it, or you want the jobs that they're going to create. Now, if one takes levelling up as being something along the lines of equality of opportunity to access better employment options, or something, whatever definition you like, but something like that, then you can immediately see that any, if you like, exogenous shock on high-tech stuff is going to do that. But very much as Jenny said in her last answer, there's not a lot of point in creating a load of high-tech jobs if there isn't anybody to do them. If all, as I think Rupert mentioned this one before, that if all you're going to do is you're just going to overheat the labour market for people with PhDs in biotech in Cambridge even more, then that's not going to do very much for insert place of choice, Doncaster, Blackpool, wherever it is. Now, what we need to do at the same time, the other risk is that, if you like, the lagging locations, or the locations that are economically disadvantaged, they get dragged into almost like a low skill, low cost equilibrium where they attract, sort of a Sports Direct warehouse or an Amazon warehouse or whatever. And that creates jobs. And I have nothing against creating, jobs, but does it mean that those people can then go on and upskill and get better jobs? Probably not. So that's the challenge. I mean, that's the challenge that we recognized a long time ago over trying to use foreign investment to generate to improve regional inequality, is because firms are not stupid. They will locate stuff where it's economically advantageous to do. And without other policies, particularly around all the stuff you were talking about in the first hour about skills, and skills, without doing something to generate a greater flow of high skilled labor, it's hard to then use foreign investment to improve levelling up. That's kind of the challenge.
Thank you very much for that, Nigel, and tying it beautifully back to the last session. I think that really fills in an extra layer to what we've just heard previously. So that was very helpful. I am conscious of time, but I still want to hear from any thoughts. Jenny, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I guess similarly, 70% of equity investment is based in London and South East. If you take London, that takes 60% of all investments from startup through to scale up, in terms of the availability of risk capital. And that obviously has, a huge impact, therefore. So where you have those thin markets and lack of access to capital, it doesn't breed and attract more capital. And also entrepreneurs themselves, of course, can't find that capital. So they either have to move away or go further away, or those invest in them gradually pull them away either from there or abroad. So that's an ongoing issue. And I said the lack of exploitation of the universities is especially acute in those areas. They are not the drivers of the centres of innovation that you see in somewhere like Cambridge or Oxford, where you've got that whole attraction of capital and all of the ecosystem that builds around it. So very poor lack of connected capital in those areas really does have a massive influence. I mean, I am interested in things like the investment zones and clusters. We have to build so much more around those outside of London and the Golden Triangle, because actually, as an investor, you look for all the bits of the jigsaw puzzle to come together in a connected way. You can't just attract, as we said, someone to put a warehouse somewhere. The whole thing has to pull together. So you need that attractive knowledge environment. You need the infrastructure that supports and attracts those businesses, and you need the players working together around that to really make it work. I am impressed, by the way, when you mentioned about West Midlands and Manchester. I mean, if you look at that, there's a very strong role that's being played by the metro mayors there, and they have actually led a very, very strong strategy on inward investment, but they've understood the need to create the capital around them and the risk capital, and create the infrastructure. So I feel there's a lot of lessons we can learn there. We need to build that into any policies we had around investment zones or how we support clusters, because we have to make those the hubs of something very much more exciting and connected than they are already.
Thank you, Jay. Rupert, any comments for you before I hand back to the chair?
Well, firstly, I think in order to get a handle on this, I really do commend the DIT statistics on where this is on the projects and jobs as opposed to capital is going. And actually, it is remarkably balanced in the UK. And you can see that Northeast and indeed Northwest have done particularly well in terms of attracting capital and projects and jobs, not quantum capital. And Scotland has done particularly badly if you were relating it, for example, per head of population as a comparative where it should be. So those statistics are on the DIT. I think the one thing I would say is, and I echo Jenny's point about how well the metropolitan mayors have done, and particularly where there is a strategy of clustering. And I'm very struck by the standout FDI city in the UK, I think, is Derby, who've accepted the fact that they've got something like 20% of their local GDP is manufacturing, whereas the national average is just under 10%. In other words, they have set their stall out as being a cluster for high spec manufacturing in the UK, and that really matters when the person building the factory is looking around Europe. They're looking for these clusters. I appreciate there are national issues, but it's quite local, and that to do with knowledge, to do with availability of capital, and of course all the local infrastructure that goes around manufacturing. So I think in terms of leveling up, I think having clear differentiated regional strategies articulated by evangelists from that area that really understand their own market, I think is incredibly effective. And then you can obviously tweak that a bit and encourage that a bit through free zones and tax incentives and the rest of it. But I think it's got to come from the region.
Right. Well, thank you. Have you finished, Mike?
Yep, I was just
yep, that's
back
fine.
To you, so thank you very much.
Right, I'm now going to turn to Charles Rose. Charles.
Thank you. I'm going to ask how UK infrastructure issues and labour market challenges affect FDI, and what steps should be taken to address these issues and encourage FDI, and particularly taken by Rupert's answer about the impact of clusters. And I think these clusters should be seen as part of the industrial infrastructure as well. But I'm going to throw this straight back to Rupert and see if he's got something to give us in relation to issues in encouraging FDI.
Well, personally, I wouldn't have built HS2. I would have spent the money on 5G broadband nationally, which would have helped this levelling up process. But I'm not trying to take a cheap point. I'm trying to make a point that actually for the right, depending on what kind of cluster you want, you need the appropriate infrastructure. And for high knowledge businesses, you need high knowledge, high capacity internet. It's an obvious point. I think the infrastructure itself doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, but it's not a big driver. I think it's an easy policy decision, and for people to make, to put a shiny new something somewhere, not a shiny new distribution park on the edge of the M1, it's going to make a big difference. But I don't think it's that fundamental a point. I think the UK infrastructure is pretty good. It's not great, but it's pretty good. And I don't think it is one of the big factors that makes a difference. I think it's the other stuff that makes a difference.
Okay, thank you. And Jenny, can I turn this one to you?
I mean, I agree. I think it's much more about enabling opportunities that are not just about kind of roads and rail or buildings. So obviously I'm very much in favour of infrastructure which is focused on on skills and on talent and knowledge. And I also do think, I think the role of our hubs of knowledge, i.e. university and our institutions, can be much better exploited locally to support the strengths. The opportunity to build around actual strengths, sector strengths and thematic strengths, I think is the way to really address this, and then creating what relevant additional infrastructure needs to be made. It isn't about putting up the roads, the rails, and then waiting for that to kind of make the difference. We have to say we are strong, as we've said, advanced manufacturing. We are strong, in clean technology. What do we need to build to make this the hub for climate change and net zero and so on? And that is actually, people, knowledge, skills, and then those enablers if we do need kind of labs and so on. But I think create that identity, create the dynamic and the connectivity between the players as well.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Nigel, can you comment on this, please?
Skills and skills, really. At both FE and HE level. If I was to do one thing, if I could have the HS2 money back that Rupert's taken back, I don't disagree. I don't disagree at all with the broadband issue. But the other thing I would do is put it all into FE. The reason that we have skills shortages, the reason that we have the labour market challenges that we've got is because FE is so underfunded. And the people running FE, I mean, the people running FE colleges do an amazing job just keeping the lights on, frankly. But they understand, they are part of their local infrastructure that Jenny was talking about. They understand their market. They understand what the demand is going to be in 2 years' time. But at the moment, they more or less have to wait until there's a skills shortage before they can persuade somebody to give them some money. Whereas actually they already work with the local employers to sort of say, right, well, we know that in 3 years' time that we'll need a whole bunch of people who know how to put heat pumps in electric vehicles. Right, so let's start training them now. Let's not wait until there's a skills shortage of people who know how to put heat pumps in electric vehicles. So I think that would be my biggest thing, because that goes back to Mike's question, that if we get that right, then you've got people being trained and being given high level skills, then the location becomes that has a good value proposition to attract internationally mobile capital from wherever.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to pass back to the chair now, because I think we're virtually out of time this morning.
Charles, thanks very much indeed. Right, we come to our traditional final question to all of our panels, where we ask you to imagine you're sitting in front of a government minister, if you haven't just had lunch with them, and you've got a chance to say, these are the 3 key policy recommendations, in this case, in relation to foreign direct investment, how to attract more of it into the UK. What are the 3 things that you would list. And some of the things you've referred to already, so don't worry about repeating them, but just to crystallize it, what are the three that you would like to put forward? I'll start with you, Jenny.
Thank you. I think I've already mentioned one. I absolutely think we have to double down on our efforts to make the pension funds unlocked. That will just form us a whole more attractive area. There is so much money out there from international pension funds, but also galvanizing our own to make that attractive environment. So okay. I do think we need to complete that. Actually, on another point that I haven't mentioned, we have to actually finish off our listings regime that started by Lord Hill, because we have an exceedingly potential attractive IPO market, which attracts fantastic international investment, but which has been failing us lately due to the challenges in having an environment those investors can invest in. We've been massively losing out to other international stock exchange on that basis. My final point really is coming back to the levelling up agenda, because I think we have to shift the focus of equity capital and broader capital towards those areas. And I think we have to concentrate that around the strengths of those areas and create much more vertical levels of capital from startup through to scale up. That means really doubling down on the opportunities offered through EIS, through the British Patient Capital Funds, to actually cornerstone that, because that really does create the environment to make those areas thrive. The lack of connectivity between capital is one of the biggest challenges for those areas.
That's really clear. Thank you so much. Jenny. Nigel, what are your three?
Okay. Closer alignment with Europe, better relationship. I'm not wanting to revisit the whole Brexit thing, but better relationship with the richer market, particularly with whom we have lots of collaborations over technology already, a sensible strategy on immigration, let firms move people around and just not be so xenophobic about immigration. And the one I've mentioned several times already, which is skills, 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 and skills. Okay,
I'll allow you to put those four into the one and make a third. Excellent. Okay, thank you. And finally, Rupert.
Thank you. Well, there's three. First is clarity on the policy of what do we mean and want from FDI, which will shape the downstream policy from that, bearing in mind that we don't need to have a consistent policy for the United Kingdom. In other words, it's perfectly legitimate that the Southeast does focus on skills and the North focuses on manufacturing. I don't see any problem with that. Secondly, once you've done that, is support those clusters, these centers of excellence, which again want to be as diverse as possible, which will have the effect of leveling up and rebalancing the economy. And thirdly, make it very easy, much easier for the personal journey of the entrepreneurs and the investors to come here. By that, I mean, for example, ease of opening bank accounts, all the boring stuff, tax regimes, all this kind of stuff, which has frankly been very difficult and has meant that we've started drifting down the ease of doing business.
Right. Well, look, on behalf of the commissioners, I think that's been an absolutely cracking session, and I've learned a lot, and we are really grateful to you, Rupert, to you, Nigel, and you, Jenny, for giving us the benefit of your expertise and wisdom. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your day, and that concludes this morning's session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.